Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. And if you can hear a whole bunch of banging and crashing outside, that's the wind. So today I wanted to talk about whether or not it's acceptable for Christians to cohabit or to have sex before marriage, or whether or not it's actually important to be legally married, because apparently people are confused about the definition of marriage, even though it hasn't really changed for thousands of years. So I thought I'd just do a video where it's like super duper clear what marriage actually means. Marriage is a commitment, and a commitment means that you don't reserve the right to just back out of your commitment at a later date or not fulfill your commitment throughout the entire relationship. Like, commitment means being committed to following through with a promise. But we're going to have a look at a few passages about what non-committal actually looks like, as well as the biblical definition of marriage. And so this comes from a question from one of the viewers. I'll just read that out. When it came to the Bible, marriage was one of those things that always confused me. Apparently, you're not really able to define words because do you have to legally be married to be married, or was doing the ceremony what made you married? Because from personal experience, not me being married, but my experience with others, was that too many people got married to the wrong person and then later wanted a divorce, and there was just so much trouble in getting the divorce in the first place. So I was like, maybe if you just had the ceremony and left the government out of it, things would have been easier. So marriage is not supposed to be easy to back out of. That's the point. It's not supposed to be easy to get a divorce, because otherwise what is the point of making a commitment in the first place? But I'm sure some Christians would be like, no, you must legally get married or have the ceremony to be married. Yes, that's the definition of marriage is that you make a legally binding commitment that's difficult to get out of. So what this person is talking about is literally the opposite of marriage. It's non-committal, it's non-commitment, it's making no commitment whatsoever, which is not marriage. Like, words have meaning, they have definitions. You need to use the definitions. If you haven't been using the definition of a word, then it's no wonder you're confused. What you're talking about in the Bible is actually referred to as concubinage. So what is concubinage? Well, let's have a look at the definition provided by Got Questions. In the Bible, a concubine is a woman who lives with a man as if she were a wife, but without having the same status as a wife. Concubines in the patriarchal age and beyond held an inferior rank. They were secondary wives. A concubine could not marry her master because of her slave status, although for her, the relationship was exclusive and ongoing. Early on, it seems that concubines were used to bear children for men whose wives were barren. Later, it seems that concubines were kept simply for sexual pleasure. Concubines in Israel possess some of the same rights as legitimate wives, without the same respect. Although it's true the Bible nowhere explicitly condemns concubinage, a condemnation can be found implicitly from the beginning of time. According to Genesis chapter 2, God's original intent was for marriage to be between one man and one woman, and that has never changed. As a matter of fact, a study of the lives of men like King David and King Solomon, who had 300 concubines, reveals that many of their problems stemmed from polygamous relationships. The Bible never explains why God allowed men to have concubines. He allowed divorce and polygamy too, although neither was part of his original plan for marriage. Jesus said God allowed divorce because of the hardness of men's hearts. We can assume the same hardness of heart led to polygamy and concubinage. We can also surmise a reason based on the culture of the day. Unmarried women in ancient times were completely dependent on their family members, such as their fathers, brothers, etc. If for some reason a woman had no family members, or her husband had died or divorced her, she would be left with few options for survival. Most women in ancient times were uneducated and unskilled in any trade. Providing for themselves was very difficult, and they were vulnerable to those who would prey upon them. For many women in dire situations, becoming a concubine was a much more suitable option than prostitution, homelessness, or death. At least a concubine would be provided a home and afforded a certain amount of care. It appears God allowed the sin of concubinage in part to provide for women in need, although it was certainly not an ideal situation. Sin is never ideal. Christians should be reminded that just because God allows a sin for a time, it does not mean God is pleased with it. So what is the biblical definition of what husbands are obliged to do if they want to call someone their wife? Well, in Ephesians chapter 5, it says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. And as Jesus said in John 15:13, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down their lives for another person." So the biblical definition of love and the biblical definition of marriage is self-sacrificial, not self-pleasurable. There are three major psychological issues that people can have which lead to what's called insecure attachments. So in psychology, there's a thing called attachment theory, which says that depending on how your parents raised you, you might not have a very secure attachment style. If your parents raised you in an environment where you felt safe and secure, where there was stability in their marriage and stability in them as emotional human beings, if they were able to self-regulate their emotions and to be responsible adults, then you will be someone who grows up to have a secure attachment style, which means that you are capable of making a commitment to another person and following through. If you were raised by parents who were unstable, whose relationship was unstable, you will have an unstable attachment style. So then, rather than being capable of actually making a commitment to another person and securely attaching to that person, instead you want sex without any secure attachment. And sex without a secure attachment fulfills three urges that someone who has an insecure attachment style has, which is the need for self-gratification, the need for self-soothing, because they can't do it themselves. They don't have the equipment and tools given to them by their parents to self-soothe. And the third one is self-preservation. And people do this in relationships all the time, where they reject someone else before they can be rejected. So we're going to have a look at a short video snippet from the Michaela Peterson podcast, where she talks with a relationship psychologist.
70% of divorces are initiated by women, but as a couples therapist, I've never seen one divorce where the husband didn't have attachment issues. What do attachment issues look like in a couple?
One thing that I see a lot is trying to earn approval by doing various things. So women with attachment issues use sex with their partner to try to get approval and love from that partner. Sex becomes almost a performative act where she's more focused on making sure he's having the time of his life instead of her having a mutual shared experience with him. As far as men, it's built on getting approval, and specifically sexual approval. It's how can I get my wife to have sex with me? He may do 10 nice things for her, and he expects her to respond with and be so thrilled that he did the dishes and walked the dog and took care of the kids that she is going to suddenly become spontaneously aroused and leap on him like a jungle predator. And when she doesn't, when she's just happy, like, hey, cool, you're holding down the fort, you're being a great partner, that's wonderful, he gets angry, he gets set, passive aggressive. He says, why isn't she meeting my needs? Doesn't she care about me?
Yeah, so men who have this type of attachment style where they see sex as a form of validation for them, and it's like their ego needs constant soothing through sex, and they can't relate to another person on any other level. They can't relate to their wife on a human level, so they just exploit her physically. So self-gratification becomes a method of self-soothing, and they soothe their unstable emotions through gratification. And when she doesn't immediately gratify their sexual urges because she's trying to relate to them as a human being, when she doesn't fulfill this fantasy that they have about marriage, then they essentially throw a toddler tantrum, because that's the emotional level that they're at. They haven't developed emotionally past the age of about 3 or 4. That's what an attachment wound is. It's not having developed past the point where you suffered the emotional wounding from your parents, which is usually in early childhood. So an unstable parental marriage actually creates emotionally unstable children who turn into emotionally unstable adults who go on to have emotionally unstable relationships where they have emotionally unstable children. And you can see how this goes on and on and on throughout the generations. So we're going to have a look at a particular passage in the Bible which deals with what the real ramifications of this kind of relationship is, especially for women, because there is a documented case in the book of Judges. So we're going to start in chapter 19 of Judges. And I'm just going to say from the outset that this particular passage is extremely violent. So viewer discretion is advised. If you have children in the vicinity, don't play this.
And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him, and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her, to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way. So they sat down, and the 2 of them ate and drank together. Then the young woman's father said to the man, Please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry. And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he lodged there again. Then he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, Please refresh your heart. So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, Look, the day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here, that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early, so that you may get home. However, the young man was not willing to spend that night. So he rose and departed, and came opposite Jebus, that is, Jerusalem. With him were the 2 saddled donkeys, his concubine was also with him. They were near Jebus, and the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, "Come, please, and let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites and lodge in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners, who are not of the children of Israel. We will go on to Gibeah." So he said to his servant, "Come, let us draw near to one of these places, and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." And they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gibeah. And when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, and also was from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveller in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" So he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. We went to Bethlehem in Judah, now I am going to the house of the Lord. But there is no one who will take me into his house, although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant. There is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square." So he brought him into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally." But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please. But to this man do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not heed him. So the man, the Levite, took his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up, and let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, "No such deed has ever been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up." Chapter 20 of Judges then goes on to tell the narrative of the Levite justifying his behavior to the rest of Israel. He seems to think that he was wronged in some way by being deprived of his concubine by rapists. And so he incites a war where hundreds of thousands of people die, which is not necessarily undeserved, but he very conveniently leaves out the part where he gave her to them. Often throughout history, women have been considered property and been considered disposable. And so denying a woman the right to actually be a wife was not considered cruelty, it was considered a man's rights.
So this is essentially how men treat women that they don't see as human beings. If a man cannot relate to a woman on a human level and see her as flesh of his flesh and protect her life with his life, then he's just as likely to throw her to the wolves. Because she's not a human being, she's a piece of property, and she's not to be treated like an equal, she's to be used and then dispensed of when she no longer serves a purpose. This passage doesn't really say why she left him, but she left and went back to her father's house to get away from him. The passage does say that he traveled an awful long way to speak kind words to her and essentially reel her back in. Which, if you have ever been involved with someone who treats you like dirt, they will come and say all kinds of things and make all kinds of promises that they have no intention of keeping. You'll hear those things like, "Hey baby, I didn't mean it. Hey baby, you know I'm not like that." And at the end of the day, it's just empty words. There's absolutely no commitment behind it. There's absolutely no intention of fulfilling those words or backing up those words with action. You're just property. And not only was that man living in sin with a concubine, but he was also a Levite, who were the priestly class of Israel. So he was a religious man. He was a man of the cloth, so to speak. He would have studied the law, he would have known the law, he would have been teaching the law, and he would have been telling other people how to live whilst living in complete hypocrisy himself. So don't underestimate the ability of someone who professes to be Christian to treat you like this. This man, for all intent and purpose, was her husband, but she was not his wife. And that's often the crucial difference. That's often why so much divorce is initiated by women, because they go into marriage with the intention to make the commitment, and then they encounter a man who is exploitative, manipulative, abusive, and they're living in constant abuse because he's emotionally unstable. The number one predictor of divorce is emotional instability in one of the partner's personalities. So if you have a look at the 5-factor personality model in psychology, if someone rates lowly on emotional stability, or if they, in other words, rate highly on neuroticism, then that's a strong predictor of divorce. That is the number one predictor of divorce. And culturally, women have been blamed for being emotionally unstable because they get to the end of their tether after years and years and years of enduring abuse, and they speak out against it, and they speak up, and they say that they won't take any more of it, and then all of a sudden they're the emotionally unstable one, even though it's actually the man who is emotionally unstable the entire time, because he doesn't know how to express any emotion except for either lust or anger. Like, that's the entire range of his emotional expression, is either lust or anger. And the anger might come out in something quite passive aggressive, like he might just sulk for days. Passive aggressive people don't necessarily do anything overt, like, punching a wall or throwing dishes or anything like that. But make no mistake, this is a form of aggression, and it's actually more powerful than an overt display of aggression. It's more psychologically damaging, because if you look at the studies of Gottman and Gottman, they look at relationships as bids for emotional connection with the other person. So someone attempts to communicate with you, that is them making a bid for emotional connection. And the other person has 3 potential responses to that bid. They can either turn towards it and interact and have an emotional connection with the person who made the bid, or they can turn against, which means that they react aggressively. And this is, of course, negative, but it's still a connection of sorts. The third option is to turn away and pretend that the other person doesn't exist. And this is actually more psychologically distressing than turning against someone, because there's absolutely no connection there whatsoever. So the bid for connection is not received. It just falls in dead air. And for creatures whose very survival depends on emotional connection and community and relationships, this is a life-threatening response. But it's also a form of gaslighting, because it actually says to the person who is denied any kind of emotional connection, it says to them, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't done anything. So not only do they deny them any kind of emotional connection, whether it's negative or positive, but they also call them crazy at the same time and undermine their mental perception of reality. So turning away is the height of emotional abuse in relationships. Grabbing your partner and throwing them out the door to a horde of men who are going to gang rape her until she's dead, that's essentially what concubinage was. And that is essentially what a cohabitation, sex before marriage relationship is. It's utterly, utterly selfish. It's prioritizing your own self-preservation, prioritizing your own self-gratification, and prioritizing your own self-soothing at the expense of another human being. So in order to get your endless black hole of needs met, you must do it at the expense of another person. So another person has to suffer in order for you to feel better about yourself.
We've discussed men a lot in this video and why they try to push a sexual relationship without commitment, but what part do women play in this dynamic? According to biologists, men are the gatekeepers of relationships and women are the gatekeepers of sex. Each wants what the other is withholding, and for some women, they think if they give a man what he wants from her, then he'll give her what she wants from him, which is a secure relationship. A man can take sex by force if he wants to, but a woman cannot force a man to offer her a lifelong commitment of security. That's the curse of Eve in Genesis chapter 3, where it says, "To the woman God said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Women long for secure relationships in unity with a husband, but it's not up to her. It's always his decision. The man determines how secure the relationship really is. For some women, they have no choice but to placate a man's demands for physical intimacy without emotional security, and wait with dread for years for that moment when he discards her and finds another desperate woman willing to sell herself out for scraps of affection. If she reaches that wall of self-respect and starts to demand basic, decent treatment, he'll shove her out the door and sleep peacefully to the sounds of her screaming, just like the Levite did. For some women, they have no choice but to be alone.
And these sorts of relationships foster another generation of the same sort of relationship, and on and on and on for generations, unless someone breaks the cycle. So hopefully this was helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and I will see you next time. Bye.